Michelle, so happy to have you. Let's start with where you start with this book, with introducing us to a man called Jervis Cotton. Tell us his story and why you start your book with him.
Yes, well, Jervis Cotton cannot vote, and his father could not vote, and his grandfather and great-grandfather could not vote, all for different reasons in the United States. His great-grandfather couldn't vote because he was a slave. His grandfather was barred because of poll taxes and literacy tests, and so throughout his life and his family history, his family has been barred from voting, and now Jervis Cotton today cannot vote because he's a felon, been branded a felon, and is currently on parole. So I begin the book with his story because in so many ways it shows how the more things change, the more they remain the same. And for African Americans and his family, none of the black men have ever been able to vote.
So you see the continuity of history right there, as you said. Jim Crow, by using that word, by talking about the system that we have today as the new Jim Crow, what are you saying? What do you mean by that term?
Well, I mean that we have managed, decades after the Civil Rights Movement, to create something like a caste system again in the United States. Although we're tempted to believe with the election of Barack Obama that we've now transcended race or in a post-racial era, the reality is that in major urban areas today, the majority of African American men are either behind bars, under correctional control, or saddled with criminal records. And once you're branded a criminal or felon, you're trapped for life in a permanent second-class status. You may be denied the right to vote, you may be automatically excluded from juries, and you're legally discriminated against in employment, housing, access to education, and public benefits. So many of the old forms of discrimination that we supposedly left behind in the Jim Crow era are suddenly legal again once you've been branded a felon. That's why I say we haven't ended racial caste in America, we've just redesigned it.
New words for very similar kinds of practices. You mentioned in the book that you didn't always think this way. You didn't always see the system that you recognize now. And I think that's true of most of us. We're not aware of this backdrop that you're describing of a racial caste system comparable to Jim Crow. For you, the turning point was a orange flyer on a wall, and I want you to tell that story just because there's people that put up flyers day in, day out, and maybe want to hear that they can have an effect.
Yes, absolutely. Not that long ago, it was more than a decade ago, but not that long ago, I believed many of the myths about our criminal justice system, and I was rushing to catch the bus, and this bright orange poster stapled to a telephone pole caught my eye, and on the poster it screamed in large bold print, "The drug war is the new Jim Crow." And I paused for a minute and scanned the text of the flyer, and I saw that a radical community group was holding a meeting a few blocks away in a small church that had capacity for probably no more than about 50 people. And they were organizing to protest the new 3 strikes law that had been passed in California, the expansion of the prison system, racial profiling, the drug war, police brutality. And I remember just thinking to myself, scanning the flyer, yeah, our criminal justice system is racist in a lot of ways, but it doesn't help to make such absurd comparisons to Jim Crow. People just think you're crazy. And then I crossed the street, hopped on the bus, headed to my new job as director of the Racial Justice Project of the ACLU. And when I joined the ACLU, I assumed that our criminal justice system had problems of racial bias, much in the same way that all institutions in our society are infected to some degree or another with unconscious bias or stereotyping. And as a civil rights lawyer, I had years of experience, working to eradicate bias from institutions. And so I thought I'll just use the same tools and strategies that I had applied in the employment discrimination context, the housing discrimination context, to criminal justice reform, and work with others to root out bias in the criminal justice system wherever it might appear. But by the time I left the ACLU, after years of working on issues of racial profiling and police brutality and investigating patterns of drug law enforcement in poor communities of color and attempting to assist people, quote unquote, re-enter into a society that never seemed to have much use for them in the first place, I had a series of experiences that began what I call my awakening. I began to awaken to the reality that we've managed to create a caste-like system in the United States again.
Well, let's talk about that word caste. I mean, for many people, if they're familiar with the word at all, it's not class, it's not race. It summons up notions of Indian, Brahmins, and untouchables, something, a status you're born with, you can't really do anything about. Are you really saying that's what we have here?
Yes, I use the term caste quite deliberately to, to emphasize, to underscore that I'm not talking here about a situation where poor folks of color are just disadvantaged culturally or impoverished or lack education and therefore are having a hard time climbing the ladder of opportunity. No, that's not what this is at all. I describe in the book a pattern and practice of targeting poor people of color, shuttling them from their underfunded, decrepit schools to brand new high-tech prisons. And this is a system that is enforced by law. It's a system of laws, policies, and practices that operate to lock people into a permanent second-class status.
But there are people who'll be listening to this and saying, but what about Oprah? What about Barack Obama? We had the civil rights movement. We don't have de jure discrimination in this country anymore.
Yes, well, it's easy to point to the exceptions, but the exceptions in some way, reinforce the rule. I mean, today, the fact that there are successful African Americans makes it easy to blame those who are at the bottom for their fate. But the reality is we declared a war known as the War on Drugs on poor folks of color. And we have gone into those communities, even though studies have now shown for decades that people of color are not any more likely to use or sell drugs than whites. We've gone into these communities of color, stopping, frisking, searching people en masse, rounding them up for primarily nonviolent drug offenses, primarily possession, and sweeping them into the criminal justice system, branding them criminals and felons, and then stripping them of the very rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement.
Now, the question comes up, why? And you partially answer it by looking at history. And interestingly, the period that you're talking about, the growth of the war on drugs, the 1980s, parallels the 1890s, post-emancipation, post-Reconstruction. How? What are the parallels? Maybe take us back there for a bit.
Yes. Well, many of you don't realize that Jim Crow laws weren't passed just out of rabid racism alone. There was an underlying politics and strategy, an attempt to divide a coalition of poor and working class people of all colors and the populist movement that had emerged. It was the first time former slaves and the descendants of slaves had joined together with poor whites in the South and were fighting for economic justice. And white elites, plantation elites, as well as the railroads and corporate power, were not happy about the populist movement and this growing interracial alliance that posed a real threat to them. And so they proposed Jim Crow laws as a way of driving a wedge between poor people and persuading whites that they should abandon their African American allies. They were essentially offered a racial bribe. If you embrace your whiteness and distance yourself from these former slaves and descendants of slaves, you yourself will not be disenfranchised, and you'll have the status of your race. But of course, we're not going to provide you the economic rights that you hoped to be entitled to. And for the most part, it worked. By proposing disenfranchisement laws aimed at blacks and a whole slew of Jim Crow laws, soon whites abandoned African Americans and the Jim Crow system swept the South. Well, fast forward to the years following the Civil Rights Movement, And you see, well, at least in the end, towards the end of the civil rights movement, where Martin Luther King Jr. is calling for a poor people's movement, calling for a movement for economic justice that would join poor people of all colors. And you see, yet again, pollsters and political strategists finding that using racially charged get tough appeals around race, promising to crack down on a group of people not so subtly defined as black and brown, could be enormously successful in driving a wedge.
You describe the conservatives of the post-Reconstruction era as making those appeals to working class whites to divide them, and finding it quite easy, actually, to stir people up. Are the Tea Parties the comparison to the redeemers of those days? Are they the equivalent group today?
Well, there's certainly parallels. There's definitely parallels. What's interesting, though, is that what we have today, once again, is a situation where poor people of all colors are being harmed severely by our political and economic policies in the United States. But a race wedge is being used to keep them divided and distracted.
Because as you point out, there is only one group of people really that you're allowed to hate these days and say terrible things about, and that's criminals. That's okay.
Absolutely. Criminals are the one group in America that we all have license to hate, which is one of the reasons why it was easy for Democrats as well as Republicans to jump on the bandwagon of the Get Tough movement. And in fact, as I describe in the book, it was President Bill Clinton who escalated the drug war far beyond what his Republican predecessors even dreamed possible. And it was the Clinton administration who championed laws, barring drug offenders even from food stamps for the rest of their lives, banning them from public housing. To a large extent, it was the Clinton administration that championed many of the laws that now constitute the basic architecture of this new caste system, and they did so in an effort to win back those so-called white swing voters who had defected to the Republican Party following the civil rights movement.
Well, so are you cheered that the moment of Clinton is over, in the sense that we're in a very different economic moment, and you're hearing from right and left, Schwarzenegger, Gingrich, and Democrats all calling for cutting down in spending on jails and cutting down in spending on the prison industrial complex?
Oh, I am absolutely thrilled that some momentum is building for prison downsizing and releasing drug offenders early, or referring them to treatment instead of expensive incarceration. But I don't think we should fool ourselves that this moment where right-wing conservatives are reluctant to raise taxes in order to maintain this expensive prison state is going to last that long. If we were to return to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement kicked off, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system could lose their jobs. Private prison companies would be forced to watch their profits vanish. This system is so deeply rooted in our political, economic, and social structure that it's not just going to fade away. We are going to have to engage in real movement building in order to trigger a dramatic shift